So a little introduction about the plans for today. We have, again, our keynote speaker, Kourosh Malek, and then we will have questions and answers. He will be speaking for about 45 minutes or so, and then I hope that we can have a nice exchange of ideas, a conversation with all of you. Some of you that I see are working into startups, right? So business opportunities, that's great. Maybe we can all learn about his experience. First, of course, land acknowledgement. I would like to sincerely acknowledge that we are gathering here today in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the coastal Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stalo, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. It's nice for us to reflect that we live, we're immersed, we play, we study, we teach in an area that has a great cultural heritage that is alive and from which we can as well learn a lot. So this is my acknowledgement, and I ask you to think, meditate, reflect on this. A brief introduction about our keynote speaker. Kourosh is director of Blue Prime Analytics. He has been involved in several initiatives between Canada and Germany. By the way, there will be the visit of a German president or prime minister or a chancellor in some few days here to UBC and Canada in general. But anyhow, I understand that he has a great training experience in Simon Fraser University, also in Germany and in the Netherlands. And lately, he has been working with us in a small initiative related to the valorization of lignin conversion to carbon material. So this is the reason for our connection. Also, thanks to Titi Shai, who brought us up the Blue Prime Analytics and their impact that is quite good and of great benefit for BPI, for the Bioproducts Institute. So you can see here, we will learn more about what he does and what Blue Prime Analytics does, but the methods that he uses are pretty interesting. Last week, we have NC State coming, and they show a little bit about what they do in life cycle assessment. This is going to be more the techno-economic assessment, but maybe there is a little bit more about environmental aspects, maybe. I'm not sure, but that would be nice to consider. And he is trained in the area of electrochemical energy materials and processes and has an MBA. So it's a very interesting career. And this morning in our group meeting, we were discussing, it's so important that we realize the need for doing research, fundamental research, by combining it also with techno-economic assessments and environmental assessment. That's very important. That's what we're going to do today. So I will stop now. Kourosh,
sure.
And I give this to you. Maybe you know how to use it, right? Already? Okay. Forward, back, and then the pointer.
Awesome. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I was told to stay here as much as I can in the beginning, so I'm just going to be here for a few minutes, and hopefully I can walk a bit. Thanks, Orlando, and all the team, Richards and Titi Chai, and all the supporting team. Opportunity to be here. That's great. It's a pleasure. We had the pleasure to working together in the past few months, and there's been a lot of learning for me as well. So I want to start a little bit by going to a few key stuff that I want to talk to you about. Not too much technical, more on the impact of what we are going to talk about is, and the state of the art of the things that is changing as we speak. Due to a lot of sort of regulation changes in the world, and then I get into the specific. So one of the things that is important in the transition to clean technologies that we have been all witnessing, all the targets that we're trying to reach in different nations, is of course a baseline target to get into reduction into certain GHG emissions by 2050. And that path that you see on the green in the figure is basically what we're assuming, that everything is staying as is. A cost is staying as is. Supply chain robustness is staying. The innovation sort of path is staying as it is. So we're not changing the way that things are innovated. Goes at the same rate. So there's a lot of risk to it, as you can imagine. A lot of things can happen from now until 2050. And one of the things that is discussed in countries' discussions as part of the mission innovation on the energy and materials is that we have to look into something a little bit more so that we can de-risk this. Because if we want to just wait until 2050 and we're not able to basically reach those, the consequence is huge. So the idea is that to accelerate innovation as much as possible, get things faster to the market as we can go, or deploy the things that has already been invented much faster. So I'm not going to talk too much about the acceleration part. I just have one slide of some few things. We can discuss that in the Q&A. I'm going to focus on the deployment, faster deployment on the things that are already invented, not yet to the market, and we have to work with. Okay, so first part about the acceleration, we hear a lot about the acceleration of the science, automation, self-driving labs, discovery, which is part of other things that I do. The problem with that approach alone, that you're just looking at inventing things faster, collecting or creating data in a cheaper and much accelerated way, it's not enough to do the innovation really accelerate to the target that we just stuck. And the problem is that you're generating same data in a faster way, but it's not the actual innovation that you need. So citing few things that is under discussion a lot nowadays on declining of the disruptive knowledge in science and technology. The fact that we're not as disruptive enough, it's becoming more and more accepted. And whichever way you want to describe this, and the reasoning behind that, publish or perish culture, localizing of the fund with a specific, labs, being against the sort of open innovation, which is a core of the fast. All that, I don't want to discuss it, but I just want to mention it's important to basically see the element of the accelerated innovation from that aspect. We can come back to that in the Q&A, but that's a problem that has to be solved. So beyond this problem, if you come to the deployment of the existing technologies that generally are those deep techs that are starting from the university labs, the highest standard of the science-based sort of ventures, clean tech investment in the past 20 years has been declining in the area of the materials and hardware. And the majority of the problem is because of the huge amount of the money that has to go. Market structure is not well known, so therefore sales of the product is not as easy. And on the top of that is the deep tech itself has a lot of risk to the sort of investors as well, and that has to be basically taken into account. But policymakers are not connecting the importance of the materials right away to the energy systems. Everybody wants to have the best battery in the world, or the best hydrogen production, or the best CO2 capture. Most of these people are not aware of the materials' role in that path. And that's one of the problems, that miscommunication of the actual problem has been a bit of problem with the investors. So I work with a lot of investors at the earliest stage, consulting to for the technologies that they're investing at university level, and that's exactly the problem. They are not aware of the materials role in all that. And we all know as a scientist that it's extremely important. So 10 years ago, if you wanted to come up with a new sort of materials that works with certain devices, the only thing you were looking at was good performance that meets or exceed the state of the art, and the cost. That's it. Recently, the three factors that changed the entire ecosystem of the materials and technologies in clean tech, and technological security, that you have to keep technologies within certain jurisdictions, and becoming more and more important. Probably more in Europe than anywhere else at this point, to extend in the US, and will come to Canada as well soon. And the other thing is the supply chain security. So that gives a lot of opportunity, but at the same time, a lot of limitations to what you do, because it's not just about creating a technology and materials that is cheaper and has higher performance, you also have some limits that it has to be, supply chain has to stay locally. You have to have a technology that stays or less reliant on basically outside technology. And last but not the least, obviously, is the circularity. So you have to make sure there's a zero emission all over from production to the recycling along the value chain. So while these things are limitations, there are also opportunities, specifically for the areas of the bioproduct materials that comes into the clean tech. And that's a reality of a lot of things that we have been witnessing. Things that are bio-based materials like eggshell, carbon-based eggshell, or similar for the batteries, work that Orlando and his lab is doing, and similar. It's becoming more and more obvious in terms of the focus. So we're not talking too much about limitations of supply chain at this point in this seminar. That's really a different topic to look at. I just wanted to mention that this is an important part of the value chain today that we have to look into. So a bit about what we're going to do and what I have been doing. We have been looking at some methodologies that basically not just looking at the properties of the materials at the lab level. We also look at market attributes. So market attributes are usually missing in a lot of pure research, and for an obvious reason. When you're not looking at deploying of the new materials into specific applications, you're looking at digging into understanding of how things works, explaining things, and then you directing towards an area that might not be sort of immediately be understood in the marketplace. And that's what we're talking a little bit about it. Technology matrices or technology development path you have to look into in terms of all the attributes from the market that has to be looked at into a development of an innovation is something that we're going to talk about. Techno-economic usually is used in a lot of different topics in systems, in materials, in technologies. Specifically, what we are interested here is not just about sort of estimating some costs through some engineering modeling. Right? It's not just about that. It's directing of a research and the lab work in some areas that needs improvement as the single or few of the attributes that are important for the marketplace. And you will see more of these examples that I bring in that are important in a lot of areas, specifically on the clean energy side, on the materials, as well as on the devices. And that's where we have been doing a lot of work on working with the labs or the venture, science-based ventures, working with the VCs and the government as well. Okay, so the agenda for today is basically looking into some of the investment methodologies that we have been looking at in the material science in general, and specifically on the energy materials, and then how that intelligence is coming into play into accelerating of the deployment. And then I'll bring you some examples and how these things will become sort of a business intelligence for the VCs and the startups themselves. So the 2x2 sort of grids, I tend to believe you can put everything in 2x2 grids really, and usually you can. Sometimes it's not as meaningful as we expect that to be. In this case, if you look at the cost of a new technology, regardless whether it's a materials or a device or all type of technologies, the cost and performance is always something that market sort of signaling all the time. Cost is not always all the problem. Performance is not always the whole problem. So you have to look at both at the same time. So if you look at the existing technology as the C naught and the P naught in that graph, and the cost of those technologies as a benchmark, and then you have a new technology that is completely different or built on the same concept with some improvement, you will see in one of these sort of triangles. You're either at the huge market potential where the cost is basically low and the performance is high, or you see it in a where the opportunity is not that much because the cost is huge and the performance is low. This is really the easiest way to look at a new technology. And of course, to look at that, you have to have a good definition of what performance means in your system. And performance is not what we describe usually as a scientist, it's what market understanding. Cost is important, it's not always easy to calculate because a process that is done in the lab has to go through a lot of sort of iterations so that you have an optimized process, and then you can calculate the cost. And this is what we're going to talk about today in the next couple of slides. But the new material commercializations really is all about getting some work in the lab, go through some functional properties as much as possible, compare that with what the sort of desired properties is. If not meeting, you go back and do it. And finally, once you make sure that the process is robust enough to be scaled up, you go into regulations. So regulations in some materials may not be as important as the others. If you use new type of carbon materials for a lithium-ion batteries, for example, regulation is that you have to make sure a thermal runaway is not within some limit. You have to do enough testing. You have to go through all the certifications. Some materials are not as important in terms of regulations, and that has to go through. So again, back to what I said in the beginning, we see more and more regulations are coming into circularity of the materials. And that's ESG sort of become part of the corporate culture, and it become more and more important. So, so the way it works in terms of the structuring of the idea of estimating a cost or the viability of the new materials is that you always start from raw materials. We call it critical raw materials, right? It could be sort of metals like lithium and so on. It could be feedstock for carbon production. Those materials are not always available in the same jurisdictions, and there's a lot of things you have to look into in terms of the reliability of the supply chain and the price vulnerability of the price in terms of the conditions of the jurisdictions, right? And that impacts a lot into the way prices happen. Performance indicator is something that you have to match to what is known in the market. The lifetime of the batteries is not exact same way that we measure that in the lab. Or the thermal runaway as a property is not as measurable in one single sort of parameters in the lab. So we have to make sure we are on the same page in terms of the performance. Sorry, I'm just going on there. And then you have to describe of your process. So basically, you have a model or you have actual process. If you have done pilot plant for your materials, you probably know how the manufacturing process look like. If you have done just the process in the lab, you sort of know which type of equipment you are planning to use in terms of or how many steps of the drying, filtering, sort of evaporation, solvents and all that you have to look into. So you have some ideas of the processes. If you have done pilot in your process, you probably have a little bit more about the equipment usage. And if you know the kinetic of the process, you know the equipment usage, which turns into the sort of labor that is used into that production per kilogram or tons or whatever the unit is at high production. Because if you are at the low production rate, you probably need a lot of raw materials. At the same time, you have a lot of fixed costs. That means you have to have the same building, same energy, same number of people, and they have to be sort of idle until new products is coming. If you have process at high production rate, obviously you have more utilization of the raw materials. So at this stage, we do some preliminary analysis just to see if it makes sense. You have some performances measured in the lab. We compare with other technologies. If it's too far from it, that has to be a focus because you are not really at par with the performance. if you're looking at the material itself as production, not integrating into a device level, meaning you have a new carbon materials, you are not thinking if it's going to be used in a battery systems or supercapacitors or as a CO2 capture. You're probably not sure where the application of the material is, and you're focusing on the manufacturing process itself. And the only sort of performance that you're looking at is that more utilization of the process in terms of the low cost and faster sort of kinetic of the production itself, so that hopefully you can bring the cost down. But if you integrate that at some point, it would be, of course, some of the factors that involve. Yes?
Are you okay if we take questions sort of through the
I'm
process?
fine as long as the time is fine.
Okay. But, what I was just wondering was a little bit, was two things. One was, how do you figure out what those performance indicators are? Because as you said, performance is defined by the market.
Yeah.
In a sense. So if you could help us with that, because I want this to be very practical. So
Sure.
you can help us. And then the second thing is, a lot of times, and of course, please stop, but a lot of times, an innovation comes up, but you're not necessarily already defined where it's going to go. So how do you manage that? How do you kind of figure out where to go and where to even start?
Right.
To figure out what performance indicators you like.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I have a slide. Next, I talk about some of those market signals. In the context of this, is that we always look at some applications when we do. I'm specifically focusing on materials at this seminar. Of course, it's all about all technologies you can apply the same way. A scientific work always is looking as an application, as the justification of the scientific work that you do. Necessarily is not towards improving of the state of the art of that, right? That's where is a boundary between making a venture out of that process or just keep that as a sort of lab scale R&D process. And that's a problem with a lot of also ventures, because the investment is based on certain sort of attribute of the market. It's pretty hot on lithium ion, for example. There's a lot of investment of the new recycling processes, and so on. But the technologies are done in a level that it still needs a lot of R&D to find the focus. And so that's really how I described it as a difference. So once it becomes a sort of a venture process, you have to look at some attributes that you have to work with there. You have to have a target market as early as possible. If you have you have sort of a business idea or the business model, are you going to produce of the product as a new materials and just leave it as that? So the areas that you can sort of make a venture out of it would be either you manufacture it yourself or you just license it to a big manufacturer, a business model that is widely used in the biopharma. Right? If you look at some other aspects that it's a focus on my talk is that we come up with new materials that has to be integrated into a device. And that device would be a battery, a solar cell, and so on. So really target market and your business model is the first thing you want to look at. These two factors are not seen as a pure sort of R&D process. As a pure R&D process, we'll look at application as the justification of the research itself. And you don't have as much focus to understand its performance. So once the business sort of model is defined in a rough sort of fashion, as well as the target market, that's where you can come to the performance. Look at the state of the art of that technology, and those numbers are not all available for all technologies in the same level. For the clean tech technology, specifically on the clean energy, we have a lot of those numbers that is defined in different jurisdictions by different sort of groups you can look at. There is no, for example, some applications of the lithium ion requires certain life cycle, like for automotive, which is not requirements of the application of the lithium ion batteries for the grid scale batteries. And that would determine how your materials would be different. And believe me, it's all in materials. It's not in device. It's all is coming into materials. And that's what I emphasized in the beginning. The venture capitalists don't understand as how the importance of the materials is. They just look at device as the most sort of understandable component of the technology in the market. And that's what we have to be working a little bit into describing. So in terms of new innovation, right? So if you have new innovation, how you can check whether it's new or it's viable, I think it goes to the same path. And of course, when we talk about innovation, we talk about an invention that has looked at the marketability of that invention. So sort of you have an idea so where it lands. And of course, you can look at sort of landscape of the patents or some other stuff that you can inherit. Generally, I think the business model and the target market is the first thing. So TDM is coming exactly at that point, that you have technical targets and you know sort of where your technology is going, and then you have some high-level targets defined for yourself. Do you want to surpass the state of the art? You probably should. If you want to sort of make a case and have sort of a good value proposition of your technology, you have to go beyond the state of the art. But it's not always about going beyond the state of the art in a venture. It's about combining with other properties you are at the right place. For example, if you're at the high end pay of the market, if you're looking at the beginning of the Tesla, for example, as an idea, and look at the high end market of a sport car, because there's a huge sort of willingness to pay for the price. Price wasn't as important because that market is paying as much as you want. Reliability and basically some other properties of the battery was important. So one is it's coming into the mainstream. Now price is also important because you want to make sure larger sort of group of people have to buy it. And that was a very interesting strategy that was taken by Tesla. That was not taken by a lot of sort of automotive companies. The other strategy I want to talk about on the regulation side is that Tesla was not a battery company, it was an automotive company. That has been a big problem with the hydrogen fuel cell sort of vehicles, as well as the other battery companies that are trying to target that market. And it takes a lot of money and also time to be a sort of automotive company which is just focusing on the electric vehicles. But that's really a big initiative and requirements that has to happen specifically on the disruptive technologies like that. Okay, so once this is done, you understand your process, you run some techno-economic. Techno-economic is really not about just the economics as it sounds in its word. It's about technology as well. So you have to look at processes in details as much as they are available. Kinetic of the processes on the material fabrication, the stability of the material, so how they are defined and how we can improve it. The integration part of materials. If you can produce carbon in 1,000 different ways, but not all carbons are making it into the lithium-ion batteries because it's about integration into the lithium-ion sort of intercalation. It's about matching with the polymer that is in the battery, and the same with a lot of technology. So it's all about technology that matches with that economics. And then finally, you optimize your process. If it works, you go back. And that's basically a process of describing, understanding, and the predictions. That's what we have to go through this process until we reach the point that we have an understanding. So I wanted to mention a little bit about what Richard does. If I took part of your program as an example, and I think it's useful to just refer to that. So what TDM is different from what traditionally used in the manufacturing industries. They call it the stage gate process, or the adoption of that into the innovation process here. The AGR is that in that process you go along all the value of the technology or manufacturing or the innovation up to the point is basically adopted as a sort of business idea and the value. TDM is very heavy technologically in the beginning. It's not about just passing from point A to B, it's also understanding how that happens and how most cost-effective way it can happen. That's what is different. So if you go sort of along this innovation value chain as is described from the lab scale, all the iterations into becoming sort of business idea, is that the role of TDM is going lower and lower because you understand system and you don't have to develop a lot of them. If your technology is changing, of course, that's going to change. So some of the things that I want to describe here is basically that's how a typical TDM look like. Of course, you can have the online version of it. We do have the sort of Excel based of it. It doesn't matter really. I just want to describe how it really works. You split all your technological advancement into categories, all the attributes that basically is a specific to some areas of the importance. For example, if you look at the high-level target of your technology, you can look at at the material level, at the device level, or at the system level, depending what technology you are basically trying to commercialize. If you are commercializing a new engineering design for the cell of the battery, and you buy all the materials sort of off the shelf, your technology is not in the materials really. It's on integration and the engineering of the cell into the device. So your focus of the target is not much on the materials, it's more on the system and the device itself. So either you are at the device level or the materials, you have some performance factors, you have some physical properties, and you have some form factors, right? So for example, if you're looking at the cell level sort of technologies, which is the example here, the TDM level of attribute at the technology, you're looking at the operation. So if you have a cell, you have to make sure it fulfills certain of the operation of a single cell as the state of the art. So everyone who has a new technology of cell for the lithium-ion batteries or the supercaps, they have certain value of the performance that it has to look into on the operation side. For example, the capacity. And the state of the art of these things is well defined in some literature. Not all of that is available for the less known sort of technologies. You have the performance, which is that unit, and you want to see if your performance compared to the target at that level. Definition of that is given, so there is no sort of discrepancies between what you measure and what you compare with. So this has to be as accurate as possible. And the reason for that is that because you want to improve that as much as possible, and that would be a target. If you're looking at system level, you are just engineering a new module of the battery or a battery pack, and just you combine it with the renewable sources, right? So this is really a different scale. You're looking at the cost and performance differently. Performance in that level is about round trip efficiency. It's not about cycle life or the capacity of the battery. It's about the energy in, energy out. You have to have over 80% of the round trip efficiency, right? If you have materials into this, of course, you have more about physical properties, which is what we have put in the other one. If you can see on the material technologies, you have performance that goes through all the properties that the proton conductivity has to be at a certain level. The permeability, durability, cost, of course, is important. Usually, if you know which device this material is going to be on, you can define cost as some other factors like thickness. Because if you have the electrode, the thickness of the electrode is a measure of the amount of the material used. And people understand that much better than basically the amount of the material that used in the battery. So these are all the technical parameters which has a signal of the market. If you buy a new sort of cell today from all the suppliers, they understand all these numbers of that specific. And that's where you basically can do a bit of research and look at what really the attributes of the markets are. Physical properties, you can go as detailed as possible. Usually it's not easy to find a state of the art in the market because a lot of suppliers don't report a lot of these numbers in their supply data sheet, right? So you have to be aware of that, of course. And if you look at the state of the art part, So as I said, some technologies that are established, we're looking into possibility of looking into a lot of that into like the DOE targets, joint undertaking for a lot of technologies in Europe. And those communities are collecting a lot of this and put that in the place so that it can be as a standard or the best practice. This is a big gap in clean tech today, though. I mean, we don't have a lot of these things sort of available for all technologies. If you test certain stability of the material in North America and Europe, you don't have real understanding of the test protocols are exact the same or not. And that's, of course, one of the problems of the slow growth of this sector. Yes.
So if I understand correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong. So the gray one is more about material centric, and it's more about device.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And you're trying to understand, okay, from the market's perspective, what those requirements are, either at the material or at the device
Which
level.
are on the state of the art.
And then try to figure out, specific characteristics, performance characteristics. So is there a strategy that you start at the systems level first, and system being where the device is kind of context of the device is in, and then work your way down to materials, or do you start materials and work your way up to device and then?
Yeah, so it's about technology of the focus. So as an example, I was exposed to a technology from Yukon in the US, Yukon, that was on new sort of cell for the hydrogen production. It wasn't about materials that they used. It was a state-of-the-art materials. They just had a specific configuration of the cell that was able to do the hydrogen production 50 times higher than what the state-of-the-art was. Of course, at the cell of a 10 by 10 centimeter, which is very small. So right away, this technology is at a very early stage. Because if it makes 50 times more hydrogen at that scale, at the scale of the 15 inches by 15 inches of the stack is gonna drop a lot of that. But right away we know that the problem is on the device level. It's not on the materials level, because it's the same materials as the state of the art. So that's put us on the device level right away to understand which attributes are there. Right? If some technologies are looking as a new materials for the adsorption, and looking at the manufacturing of that materials so that it can be done in much faster and cheaper way, so that it meets the same requirements as the other state-of-the-art, but cheaper manufacturing process. We know we're talking about materials technology, not cell technology. So that's basically understanding of where your technology is landing, which may change sort of over time of the venture itself. You start with sort of materials, and we have seen that a lot of that with the ventures on hydrogen and batteries. They start with materials, they ended up to be a device manufacturer because they can't compete anymore on materials level. They build a new device which has everything exact same as everyone else, except it uses a new type of the polymer as a binder. And that's a technology. They become a sort of manufacturer by joint venturing with some other sort of manufacturers, or being bought out, that we are seeing a lot of that happen. So it's changing over the time. At the start, it's all about technology, how you want to focus, and of course it's changing.
One very brief comment.
Sure.
Of course, you are referring to clean tech and
Yeah.
you are referring to batteries,
Yeah.
right? But it's interesting that if you think about budget products and if you think about packaging materials,
Yeah.
the matrix that you have on the right pretty much applies exactly the same to barrier properties in packaging materials.
Absolutely.
So it's exactly the same. What is maybe different is the blue one.
Yeah.
But many properties are more or less related, and you can really understand very easily, regardless of the application, right?
Absolutely.
So it's interesting.
Yeah. So you can exactly have a TDM for a drug, for a pharma, right? Easily, because the drug has the effectiveness at this rate, has to have certain sort of absorption properties at that rate, and it's very simple. And that's why the biopharma is very strong, because they don't have a lot of attributes to deal with, and the demand is high. And you check a lot of these things. We don't have any sort of large scale batteries in the market yet to understand sort of how they work. And we have a lot of these numbers lacking really. So if you have a target materials that you want to use for clean energy, you have to go a long way to see how it fits because there hasn't been a lot of demand for it, and that's a big problem. In some consumer-based product, as you mentioned, it's much easier because people understand the attributes right away. Yes, please.
Would you go as far as saying that basically every innovation needs to have a TDM?
Yeah, so you don't have to call it TDM. It has to have some guidelines and the roadmap, what the target is and what sort of basic understanding of application is. Technologies are developed in a way that basically you improve of the state of the art of the understanding of it, which is very important. Understanding is extremely important as a scientific sort of insight. Once it becomes a product that adds value as a business, I think you have to have something like TDM into it. And I think that's a level we have to understand all this. Not all the technologies or the inventions are coming into that level, but I think at that level is uniformity of that is part of the acceleration we're talking. So one of the problems that a lot of technologies are just going back and forth through the loop because we don't have these TDMs types of focuses. And of course, we can have a lot of argument of how this happens, but that's a big problem. Yes. So in that sense, once it becomes a business value, I think it has to have something like TDM that. Okay, so big question. I have to go fast. Where the problem of the data is, and that's a big problem. Data is not available. So whoever has this data in one technology at the large scale and more reliable, I think, can be really successful in evaluating of this. We have been fortunate to look at a lot of technologies on the batteries and hydrogen. I've worked a lot of sort of ventures, understand limits, and intuitively I can put a lot of these things in the map, but for a lot of technologies it's not as easy. So you have to go through a lot of this to understand. So data is always a big problem. Materials properties is well established as material scientists or engineers have put a lot of these data bases in place, but a lot of those are not applicable to the clean tech really because they are not within type of materials that we have to use and the attributes are not within those tables. Like for example, if you look at carbon, the intercalation properties of the carbon to lithium is not in any material science engineering sort of literature, or the absorption of CO2 and the BET isotope of that is not there. So you have to look a lot of this. If you look at literature, we can extract a lot of this and understand it, but DOE and a lot of this sort of entities, that's exactly what they do. The IEA and some other sort of entities, that's exactly what they're trying to harmonize the best practice of looking into this data as much as possible. We have a long way to go. Back to what we discussed, a more product is consumer-based rather than sort of B2B type of products. You have more understanding of those attributes. A more product is going to the businesses, has a long way up to sort of development to get into in front of the consumer. It has more attributes that are very unknown. Regression and sort of recommendation models is something we look at a lot right now using sort of machine learning and so on. If we have certain properties of the materials is missing and we have large data sets that have those, we're trying to basically do regression and fill all the gaps. The more data is available, the more you can basically be confident of this approach. But that is done a lot in this case. The historical data are not, if you look at the specific test is done on the certain materials in two different publications, the metadata is not there. It's very hard to basically compare exact temperature or the calibration and the measurements. While they are very important, it's not as reliable as it should be in the beginning. So those performance measurements are extremely important. Specifically, VCs don't understand, of course, these details of the performance measurements, and they just look at the differences. But that has to be important, sort of documented in your venture as much as possible, so that it covers all this as it needed. Supply chain data is important for the pricing sort of volatility of the raw materials that comes into your place, and as well as some other sort of databases I listed here, the OpenEI, the Energy Intelligence from DOE, the EU Open databases. You can see a lot of these things there, but it's not as perfect as they wanted for all the technologies. Okay, let's talk about cost assessment now. Now we understand our technologies, we know the attributes, we know performance. Now we have to look at the other elements, which was the cost. So how do we calculate the cost? We have looked at some approach that was, I have to mention the work of Alicia for the first time, sort of took the approach that was taken into manufacturing, into production cost of the manufacturing into the materials. Combine that a lot with the attributes of the material fabrication process, which includes the process kinetics, the amount of the material used, material properties, and so on. And then we took that together a bit, applying to energy materials for the energy applications, and that's basically more used for de-risking of the R&D and the process of the improvement of the materials to become venture ready, as we call it. So the tool that we have is basically, sort of in a nutshell, without going through a lot of the equations is used, is that you have a database of the materials. So we talk about that. You have a good understanding of the performance from your TDM, definition of the process of testing. This is all sort of well documented in your technology. And then you have the inputs that you have to get in terms of the amount of the material used, the scrap rate, and so on. So what you do in your cost calculation, really at the end of the day, is the splitting of the material cost and the labor cost and the fixed cost, which includes of certain of the plant costs and so on, plus the amount of the material used for the production. So if you look at the equation that basically describe of the materials used, you have to look at also the equipments in parallel, because some equipments are using materials and the production is not 100% sort of efficient. So you have some scraps, and that goes into the waste. If you are at the high volume, kinetic of the forming A to B is different, and the amount of the materials that is used also impacting of this kinetics. Kinetics is important because it's changing the amount of the time the equipment is used. If you have 10 hours for 10 kilograms of certain materials to be converted to a new sort of form of material using a catalytic process, that kinetic is determining at how much sort of equipment usage you have. If you know how much the equipment usage you have, you can estimate that how much labor you require to basically run those equipments. And that's how everything is coming all together as a cost. So all the material costs and the equipment costs, all the process costs, and that's how we calculate this. And then you have the outputs. You basically change the amount of the raw materials, or you remove some processes in between. If you have a more efficient way of drying, for example, it could impact the usage of the dryer, or sort of eliminate 3 out of 5 of the drying processes, and that would have impact into lowering of the cost. So now, question that you all have is that if I have a process in the lab scale, and I'm just putting a lot of these sort of lab equipments together, so how do you understand that at the larger scale it's going to feed into certain equipments or the dryers, or how this process is really replicating or representing of what it would be at the larger scale? So the answer is that it's not that easy. So one way is to simulate your process. If you don't have any data of the pilot structure of your process, and no one has done this process that you can compare with, so sometime if you build a new polymer, the process of fabricating a polymer is very similar, more or less in a lot of cases. You can replicate, you can basically mimic that process and use that as your basis. If that's not available, you have to look at some process model and see which process is more optimized for the manufacturing. And that basically is the blueprint of your fabrication process as you move forward. So that's the answer to that is that at what stage of the development you are. If you are at the very early stage that you just trying to sort of fix some properties or some process factors, it's too early to basically define that. If your process is generic enough that you can compare to a lot of similar processes, you are in a good position because that's your starting point. Might not be the optimized process that you want to sell to a VC at the end of the day, but it's a process you can rely on in terms of sort of optimizing your costs as you move forward. If it's an entirely new fabrication process that has not been done or there's a lot of unknowns, you have to go through process modeling or the engineering process model. And that's what it happens in a lot of cases. In batteries, we don't have that much problem. Every battery is made the exact same way. The only thing is changing, I'll tell you a bit. So this is basically summary of the cost of the fabrication. You have to break your production process into steps. That's very important. You have to have some steps. You can make it as general as possible. You can break it down to 20 steps or 5 steps. You have to have steps regardless. And then you have the variations in time constraints. As I said, time is extremely important because it's the equipment usage. Equipment usage is the labor usage. If you have sort of automated plan, of course, you can look at all the energy consumptions instead of the labor use. And then you have the identifying of the major equipments. As I said, it's difficult if the process is not being done before. You have to optimize sort of operating units and see how that works. If you can define that in the pilot, some processes you can actually apply to the pilot. So if you have a process for the fabrication of new membranes, for example, for the redox batteries, you can go to a lot of sort of engineering firms and ask them to put that into their pilots. So you can see how that works in a pilot production. The academic literature for the technical parameters is good, is not enough, is not as effective as it should be. So you have to look at beyond that. And I think at the level of what you do as an expert in your area, you probably know how the limitations of the techniques are, but that's extremely important for comparing with the state of the art and the numbers that you put into your TEA. So it has to be really important. Supplier is important because you want to see price changes of the raw materials is function of what factors, right? So if you're using platinum and carbon and some other sort of polymers, and you know how the supply chain of these things works, you basically have some ideas of the prediction in 5 years how these things will change. And we have done studies in that level that we have looked at the 10 years sort of historical data of the cost of the materials, and we have predicted the next 5 years. Not accurate, but it's representative of some factors that is not existing in all materials. And then finally, sensitivity analysis. If you want to see all the cost of labor, why? Because Canada is providing subsidies for the battery manufacturing. So if the most cost factor of your case is the labor, you have to find a better jurisdiction that you can apply that. So you can do a lot of sensitivity analysis depending on the model that you want to look into. You can also look at some externalities. For example, if your supply chain is all here, cost of production is high, but you have some subsidies on the tax basis, that makes your cost very competitive. So you have to look at a lot of this sensitivity analysis. And again, it's done at the end of the road, really, when you have everything sorted out in the beginning. So as I said, battery is not an issue. We know process of the battery manufacturing. So what you do is that you have a new raw materials for the battery, either a new lithium, new type of the oxide, or new type of carbon as the anode. So knowing only cost of that carbon is not enough to estimate if your carbon is working with this type of battery. And the problem is that properties of the carbon that you put as raw materials is going to impact the way casting happens. Processing of the cathode, it has to be mixed with the polymer at certain rates, and it has to fulfill some requirements at the cell level. the durability has to be changed, or will change as a part of the equation. The cycle life might be carbon is carbon, conductivity is good. When you put it in practice, the rate of the lithium ion intercalation is so high that you lose the functionality at, let's say, 1,000 cycles. And what happened in a lot of ventures at that point, they limit their market potential. So, for example, if you have a new type of carbon materials that applies to certain technologies of the batteries, and you can only fulfill 1,000 cycle life, your target market is probably not hybrid electric vehicles, because you need hundreds of thousands of the cycles. It may be electric vehicles because you only have like 10,000 or thousands. Or you just focus on the grid scale. And that's an example of, if you want to fix that technology, improve it, invest more money on the R&D, or just stop that and go to the market. And that's, the strategic decisions are extremely important at the level of understanding of your target market, which we're going to refer to that as well. Okay, so this is a summary of the sensitivity analysis that you can do from breakdown of the cost of the materials. If you have 10 different type of raw materials and the processes, and you have something, we call it the economies of scale, that basically at the low production volume to high production volume. The more you are producing, the cheaper process would be, because you use the same amount of the fixed cost for the large amount of the production. These are very sort of hypothetical in that sense, because, for example, in a lot of technologies like hydrogen fuel cell, we don't even have 10,000 sort of unit of demand today. So if your projections is looking into best pricing and competitive at 1 million units, we're not even there. It takes probably 50 years to get there at the rate we're going. So it's not as viable. So you have to look at also the production volumes that is more viable given your time frame and the roadmap that you're looking. If you're looking at 5 years of the production, and you have to look at the technologies that basically able to get that. So these are the sensitivity analysis we do. And the important thing that I want to describe, if you remember the things that we discussed a little bit in the beginning of the cost and performance, and where your technology is sitting, now everything is coming together. Now we have the cost of technology we calculated, we had a performance of the technology, which depending on whether it's a material fabrication process, or the battery manufacturing, or the cell level sort of manufacturing, how that would change. So as you can see, you have some technologies that are already in the market. Let's say the yellow one, they are in a good spot. They are at the low cost and high sort of performance. Your technology, after all calculation, is sitting somewhere in between of good and bad. It's not as bad. You can't compete with that technology in a sort of head-to-head, but still is not. If your technology is sitting on where the gray is, it's basically at the low cost and low performance. You don't want to be really where it's extremely expensive and very low performance. That's a bad sign. Either your target market is not correct, or you're not looking at the right numbers. And you have to look at all the processes as you go. So this is extremely important factor. So you can see, for example, the performance and the cost, if you're sitting in the incumbent P, as we call it, it's good. If you sit on the top, it's not really good. So that's basically, you have to make sure that you look at this. The other thing is important is also the segmentation of the market, which we can do at this point when we have the idea of the performance and the cost. The willingness to pay is basically applies to a lot of technologies and is right there. It's not very difficult to understand those. You can call a battery cell manufacturer or just ask for a quotation. They basically tells you how much the price is, and that's the willingness to pay of everyone. If they are selling tens of thousands of the units, that's what people are paying, right? If you have that willingness to pay, in the energy systems, we usually report that at $1 per kilowatt. If you buy a cell of the batteries, you don't buy it as a dollar, you buy it as dollar per kilowatt. And the same thing with a lot of materials as well. So if you have some applications, you see that some of this sort of willingness to pay is very broad. So we have done studies on this for the automotive, from the electric vehicles and hybrid and plug-ins in the past. And looks like range of people that pay for the plug-in is much lower than what people pay for the hybrid. So hybrid electric vehicle, people pay anything from $300 to $800 per kilowatt. And that's basically a range that if your technology is within that range, it can compete. It is within the range, but at the same time, it's not as competitive because it has to compete with a lot of other technologies. If it's sitting at the lower range, it's more specific, and you have to bring your cost to that level. If you bring it, you are more competitive. So it's about strategizing your competitiveness into the marketplace that you're focused. If you look at the battery technologies in general, or the supercaps, or the carbon materials for the supercaps that sit into some of these technologies, sometimes you also look at the industry verticals that you want to focus on. Grid scale versus automotive, that's a large sort of range of the applications. So you are just exclude all the automotive and say I'm looking at a very sort of expensive part of the market to build, because you have to bring your price up to $100 per kilowatt, and it's not very easy. If your price is at 500, 600, bringing down to 100 is not easy. If you bring it, you're probably very successful. So that's strategizing of the vertical that you want to focus on. And we call this market segmentation. Okay, some use cases that is done in the real world. So some specific process we look at. New fabrication process of the new catalyst to templating. It turned out to be very expensive, even at the high volume. And although it was a technology I could use at the time for the fuel cell at the time, now if you look at this technology for hydrogen production, it may actually work in a good way. So waiting 10 years, that's what we did like 10 years ago. It could be something to look at. We look at the membrane fabrication process using a new fabrication process. So simply a process has been adjusted by removing some of the key processes into some cheaper and more sort of cost effective. And we look at the economies of scale, or fabrication of a new nanostructure type of materials compared to the state of the art. And what you can do, of course, you can go all the way through the steps of the process. For example, the annealing process, the roll transfer, because that was a roll-to-roll process in the fabrication, and you can look at all these factors in the details you require. Okay, so once you come to the materials, I want to talk a little bit, maybe 2 minutes, about how you transfer to a system and device, right? Now you have built the materials that fabrication makes sense. Yes, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of go back and make sure I understood the sensitivity analysis and how it gets used. So I guess if I understand correctly, there's kind of two things we're trying to understand. One is at the sort of the materials level, we're trying to understand which parameter or attribute really moves the dial. And is that what the sensitivity analysis will help us with? And then there's a macro level, which I also was trying to figure out, okay, macro level, where does this best fit in? But is that the first step? Is that the...
Yeah, so first step is to understand the impact of all the parameters and which one is the more sensitive one. Of course, that's, as you said, it's a typical definition of sensitivity analysis. The other part is that you want to strategize your focus as much as possible, and you want to see the impact of that focus on the other part of the equations. If focusing too much on the stability would have impact on the use of raw materials and therefore the cost, and you have to see how much room you have to basically change that. So it's really both. The typical sensitivity analysis we do on the process optimization or understanding of the impact of the process steps. And the other one, as you said, we're doing for a sort of a strategizing of our focus. Make sense? Okay, so very quickly, we're going to... It doesn't work. just going to this. Okay. I talk too much or what? Is it blocked or what? It doesn't escape. Anyway, so what I want to talk about in just 5 minutes is that, okay, now you have a new type of materials. You don't want to manufacture materials. You just want to have a good process, sort of blueprint, and sell licensing to a big manufacturing company and build it. But you want to convince them your material is the best choice for certain sort of storage technologies, either supercaps or the batteries or redox battery and so on, depending on your material. So some market structures, such as grid-scale battery, is very difficult to deal with because compared to the automotive that you have only one type of batteries, grid-scale batteries you have all kind of batteries: chemical, electrochemical, mechanical, thermal, and your technology has to compete with not just one technology set, it has to compete with a lot of verticals. And that's very important to understand when you want to choose your application. So the reason I brought this is that the energy materials, as we call it, is different from functional materials as most of us are familiar with. So functional materials has certain properties that goes into hand of consumer and being used as an attribute. Energy materials has to go to a device and being integrated. And the problem with the integration process is that it's expensive, it needs huge amount of the R&D, and most of the research labs don't go that way. They just stop right at the lab and they expect that to go. And then the burden of the R&D of integration is going to the venture because you spin it up right way and you want to get into that, but you have to spend a lot of money on the R&D to do integration. So really, a target market at this level, especially for the integrated materials, is understanding of the integration. So if you have ways to basically change the integration process in terms of the cost and reliability of that, and make sure that you understand all the processes that you have to go through, it saves you a lot of money down the road as a venture because you have to spend a lot of this money. And of course, so having a good integration is good, but then if it takes 5 years, you're losing market opportunity. You make it better and cheaper, but you probably lose market opportunities. So the time frame is very important, and I think the reason I put it in the green is that it's a long process. So we do a little bit of activities on that scale as well to see if the integration makes sense. So integration is all about two materials can work together really well. The function of the membrane and the catalyst has to go hand in hand. And this is not the problem with the materials which are functional, that you just use them as they are and just make them cheaper and more stable as one property space. So we developed some sort of understanding of this in terms of the device level and the system level understanding. It's a different level of looking at the problem. It's not at the materials level, it's at the system level and the device level. If you want to make sure that the two technologies that are competing, they work in a sense that they can be cost effective, at the same time, cost of the materials is low, the integration is high, or some reliabilities are required. You have to look at technology by technologies. And a good example of that is the grid scale sort of battery industry. It's extremely competitive. There are about 15 technologies in the marketplace, technology types, and so many innovations. And they have to compete all this. So sometimes it's important to look at your application in this market. For example, if you use the storage for the bulk storage, there's not a lot of competitions with some other technologies like flywheel in that sense. So you don't have to compete with sort of electrochemical and chemical technologies. So just talking about this part is that if your materials is going to be integrated into device, you have to have some understanding of the marketplace of those technologies. In the automotive, it's much simpler because it's either lithium ion or not. In the grid scale, it's different because you have a lot of other technology verticals that you have to compete. So the way we do this cost calculation is a bit different. At the materials level, you know exactly how much it costs. At the system level, we're looking at the services that it provides. So it's called a cost-benefit analysis. And the way we do it is that benefit is cost, is the revenue minus cost. So if you know the cost of your process, you know how much you're making, the difference is your profit. In the context of the grid scale, the cost is the capital cost of buying the storage and running it, right? In terms of the, installing it, the tax you have to pay, the charging cost because you have to charge it all the time, the electricity costs money, and the O&M cost, the maintenance and operational. So that's your cost. The revenue is from the services. If you give services to a utility, they pay you per kilowatts of the electricity that you generate. Or you work with the peak shaving sort of services in utility, that's how you calculate revenue. The difference between this is your profit. So you can easily see if your technology that you're developing for that specific sort of vertical, it makes sense in terms of being only one technology or no. If you run these scenarios, you can look at a lot of services, a lot of technologies on the right side. We build the databases of what we just discussed previously here in terms of all the factors involved in the technology attributes. And then you can see that you can basically see for the specific scenarios that you have, the flywheel is the technology of choice. So therefore, your lithium ion is not as competitive for that service. So you're not focusing on that service in your business plan or in your business model. And that's what sort of another things we have done in a different scale. So I'm going to move on at the end to talk about how all these things is coming into a sort of venture capitalist. How we can communicate this to them so that they can actually apply that to a decision. So some example of that is coming, they look at the product and market. So how many more minutes? 5? Okay. You have product and you have market. So basically, it's either a new product or a new market, and that's basically a strategy as you were. It's very well-known sort of diagram that you have. So one of the things that we simplified for an investor is that they come with a new technology. We have done all these calculations in the background already. A new technology has some attributes that the state-of-the-art of the incumbent technologies have, and we just drag it into the same graph. And here you can see if that technology is competitive. It's basically a surface area of the spider chart in one notch. It's very simple understanding for them because they know which kind of questions they have to ask of the inventors. And a lot of them don't know exactly what that would be, right? And that's important factor. So this is, for example, for the PEM electrolysis, you can look at different catalysts for the CO2 conversion process. You can look at the attributes related to the metal and metal oxides class of the materials. And you can also look at a lot of these things in our databases. You can look at if you change the catalyst, so how it's impact the fact if they have a copper-based sort of catalyst versus the others, you can compare all these factors. And the other thing, sometime in for example, the CO2 reduction, you have selectivity as another problem and elements. In the e-fuel industry that is pretty hot today is that you want to make sure that 90% of your product is becoming methane as much as possible. So your catalyst has to be as selective as possible. And that's basically, that level is extremely important for productivity of the process. And investors don't look at a lot of these cost numbers that we have calculated in the database, but they understand that where the technology is sitting. So from that perspective is important. So I want to finish this with few notes that as you saw in the materials, especially integrated materials, it's a difficult thing to do. It's not as simple as one factor, and we have to look at a lot of factors. So you have to look at the technical characteristics, which unfortunately is different scale to scale. At the scale of materials to the component to the devices, and devices to system. And also it's different lab to lab. If each lab has its own protocols, there's no, best practice or standard in a lot of this, and not being. So if you look at biopharma, you have a lot of standards of the protocols. We don't have a lot of that in the clean tech, specifically on the energy tech. And then you have the material to devices and device to system level that you have to look at. Some other things that you want to look into, we didn't talk a lot about, is the socioeconomics and the environmental impact. So that comes into effect into sensitivity analysis that we talk about. Is your supply chain net zero, or circularity is there? Is your supply chain is robust, and it follows the requirements of the technological sort of process that the government is putting in terms of reliance on the outside technologies. And these are all factors that are coming into effect. And finally, I talk about some investment decision that has to happen as quick as a day. And then you have to be able to basically communicate that as much as possible. Okay, so I finish here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kourosh. It was really great. Of course, it's a very high level. You can see, at least my take home message is a level of complexity, and the secret is in the data and information. If you have that, then you can do a little bit of this exercise. And if you have an entrepreneurship possibility, maybe it's good to get more or less advice from those that already have been established and doing this for a long time. That can be a good start. But I would love to hear questions from the audience, especially those that are thinking about the same. While he was talking mainly about energy materials, of course, I can translate that very much to the things that we're doing in BPI, packaging materials, membranes to replace naphthalene.
Yeah.
There are many examples, carbon materials as well. So I think we can make connections between those dots. Questions? Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm not familiar with battery manufacturing very much, but you mentioned that they're made by solvent casting. And I'm doing biopolymer films, and I also do the solvent casting. And so is it then a process that's scalable? Like,
Yeah.
can I do this at a very large scale?
Yeah, it's a scalable. I mean, a lot of equipment, it depends on your solvent types and evaporation rate, how it changes the microstructure of your system and all that. So there has to be a way that you control the rate. In batteries, it's much easier because the solvents are pretty sort of well established and they're slurry, and then the rates is within a range that the microstructure changes is not as severe to change the sort of the whole properties. But if you look at a sort of membrane, for example, or you look at new carbon materials, that the evaporation rate is changing the particle size immediately, and then you have to control it. It's different. But yeah, it's possible to do it. It depends on your solvent and the evaporation rate.
You can appreciate why the IT companies and startups are so successful, right?
Yeah.
Because they don't need to go to a very large extent through this exercise, right?
Absolutely.
They've just got a software and then they
Yeah, so-
get a lot of revenue out of it, right?
Yeah,
So-
no, there is no question that 99% of investment is going that far. We do have investments on materials, but it's a long way and it's expensive. And I think what I try to convey as a message is that you don't want to transfer a lot of your R&D costs into a venture, and that's the biggest problem. You have to de-risk it as much as possible at the R&D level in the lab by focusing on certain areas that you can excel. So if you need 10,000 cycle and you're there, you just stay with that market. Don't go to 100,000 because you can't compete, because you have to spend a lot of money to get into that. I think this is the actual message that I wanted to make.
One reflection about bioproduct development. There is a big plus, and that would be that we usually connect with consumers directly, as opposed to what you show here is more or less intermediate entities that create a device, right?
Absolutely.
But in many bioproducts, you are thinking on connecting with the consumer, and the consumer perception then becomes very important, and that's something that you can use as a leverage. People are willing to replace a petroleum-based material by a bio-based material, even if there is a premium, right? So it's a huge incentive in that sense.
Yeah, one other thing is the field testing. You can do much faster
Right.
field testing with the consumer materials that you do.
Right.
Energy materials, for example.
On the flip side,
Yeah.
and that's the problem with bioproducts, that most of technologies and integration possibilities are already well established in petroleum-based processing.
Mhm.
You need to create new processing methods for bio-based material, right? For instance, in petroleum-based processing, you use plastics, you use heating as a form of transforming materials. When you deal with bio-based, you cannot use heat. You use water as a medium for transformation. And that makes the whole building and the production or development of biomaterials a little bit challenging because you need to come up with new infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge challenge that is not.
But the opportunity and circularity requirements.
Yes.
And the raw materials that has to be within, I think that's a huge opportunity for the biomaterials as well.
That's a big pool. If you think about what is required now, circularity, net zero mandates, and all of these, right? Footprint. Yeah. Yes, Richard.
Well, I was going to make more of an observation to build off which the ATR program is supporting researchers. Take that technology just a couple more steps to get it closer towards that pathway towards impact, right? And I really feel that it is something that's super valuable for ultimately impact. Get it to the point where somebody's ready to write that first check, or somebody's ready to start to invest in it. So getting it to that point is so valuable, and also pretty exciting too. Like I think perspective would be all kinds of great stuff getting into the real world and really understanding the realities of, actually, you have to be this way, accept it or whatever, right? So that's just super exciting and also challenging. No fun stuff. I'm really glad that you're, by the way. Right? And we're here to support, by the way. If there's any questions or ideas or insights or just contact the guys who want to support on your ventures. We're just getting into the next round, I would say, of ATR program for the project, for ATR projects this year. So that's my insight.
To put this in context, more or less, the reason for this presentation is that we have been working together in the area of adoption of lignin in energy material, right? And that has triggered a lot of thinking. And this is a great exercise because we learn a little bit about the details of the whole thing, right? So I think this can be translated or extrapolated to other opportunities. There are many, right? I mean, the lignin is a case study, but there are many more coming, hopefully. Ido, and then Ayako.
Just relevant to energy materials specifically, I guess in the past several months there's been some pretty drastic legislation that would change the space very much. So I guess in this kind of framework, how do we account for policy, particularly when we expect kind of things relevant to gigantic policy moves? And also maybe specific.
Yeah. So it's all about the technological sovereignty that I talk about. That's all about the supply chain security because that has been obvious in the past 2 years how it can change everything from the price of the components in everything we do and all the energy materials, energy becoming a big part of what we do soon and being as reliable as that. So I think in the context of changing, so a lot of changes into legislation of the subsidies, for example. You're probably familiar with the Volkswagen battery manufacturing, just happened last year here. And the only reason they come to Canada because we bet the subsidies that US would offer them. And the lower sort of labor cost as well. So it impacts a lot of sort of decisions in that level. In terms of the cost of your manufacturing, that's how Volkswagen is looking at the manufacturing costs, right? Like coming to Canada, it's reliable in terms of the supply chain security. Its technology would stay as much as possible in Germany and here, and that would be something that it changes the sort of ecosystem of the supply chain in a larger scale. And still, we are relying on a lot of raw materials outside these regions, right? So we still have to rely on the raw materials that are coming from other places, and I think that's going to change soon, and you will see more and more opportunities to build supply locally or regionally as much as possible. So changes of that is on the cost from the manufacturer point of view, but in terms of the venture, is the opportunities on the raw materials as well.
Canada is in a very good position if you think about raw materials, minerals, oil,
Yep.
forests, bioproducts. Canada is a really great position if they play the cards right.
Yes.
But they're-
This is more like question and comment mixed together.
Sure.
I think so. I'm an industrial designer trying to demonstrate the material function of the lab study, no science. So it's important for me to understand how market, what kind of things wants, what kind of things is needed in the market. I'm very grateful that I could see the very advanced analysis here. I think Richard also asked you in the presentation, but I think it's not necessarily easy for researchers to identify the chance of the material and the potential of the material. And it might be easier if you have some like two more questions. So, for you probably it's very standard, but for us, maybe that could inspire our ideas. Like, have you checked the analysis of I, or like have you checked the material property this aspect? That kind of question is have.
Yeah.
That might be easy for us to identify.
Yeah, so in the TDM that I had, I didn't show you any Excel file. I had it in my laptop. I thought we could do that, but there is a column that is the importance and priority. So if you look at a lot of this column of the state of the art, and then you have priority. That priority is how you communicate. Like if you have certain materials that is of those attributes, one or two are the high priority, it means that's how market is looking at it as an attribute to look at. And that's would be in the communication that you're talking about is questions are embedded into that and it can be built, but you can build all these priorities really in that graph. Questions can be built out of those priorities and be translated into understandable version. But we haven't done these questions really because my role was to looking at these numbers and evaluate if it's within the range. Because I was communicating more to the investors, not to the inventor, right? So on the inventor side, I think it's more important about the sort of understanding what would be seen and how easy it is to communicate. And I showed you those spider charts, right? Or something similar. It's very easy to understand that whether it's competitive or not, or what attributes I have to look into in my evaluation, or what sort of questions I have to ask the inventor to basically come with a background of the technology. Did it answer the question?
But the communication and marketing of ideas is super important because investors will
Yeah.
look at those diagrams
Yeah.
and metrics, but also how to pitch your ideas is super critical, right, in the decision making at the end. So this is part of the process, I think, that we need to be trained. Richard.
Just to build that quickly, I was going to say, but even if we did as universities as a whole, like percent of the children here today, that already would be
Oh,
a
absolutely.
little step forward
Yeah.
in terms of communicating to reality that our activities can have. Like,
Yeah.
you don't have to go all the way.
Yeah, so I didn't go through the acceleration innovation or those, controversies of how science is becoming less productive in terms of that. And these are real things. It's not, you can see all over sort of discussions everywhere about it. And one of the problems is exactly not looking into those details of the research, which is important, but has to be directed as much as possible. And I think we're reaching to a point that we have to be direct to make changes and impact.
One maybe technical question in your economic of scales. I saw in your plot that you went from $800 per kilogram or kilowatts down to almost zero when you increase the number of produced units,
Yeah.
when you increase the production rate. So that's a huge change. I want to know more or less, what is that reduction that you have with the
Yeah, so that one was a sensitivity analysis.
Yeah.
It wasn't really actual case.
Right.
So usually, as I said, you can if you look at economics of a scale, you go to 4 million units. Consumer products, easy because you just have to sell more. these things is not as easy. You have to manufacture more, and you have to have demand. We don't have a lot of demand. So really, in sensitivity, you can go up to 10 million and bring the cost from 800 to under 50. But the reality is that in the next 10 years, you can only do 50,000. You can do 100,000. So really, you're just looking at the first small part of that graph. So that's what is an example of sensitivity. I think the problem of demand is a big part of the whole story.
Yes.
And I think we have to understand that really well in terms of the economics of a scale when we present that as well as a way of cost reduction. So that was just for the sake of the sensitivity.
Yeah, but it's very relevant.
Yeah. Okay.
More questions? So yeah, we need to leave the room because there is going to be an activity here. Actually, it's not one, so it's not too big rush, but they need to prepare the room. So anyhow, so thank you,
Yeah, thank you
so much. We have a little.
Thank you.